What made China so powerful? When things were different. This part of the world used to be the world's biggest economy. There were kingdoms that learned how to make everything from the compass to gunpowder, as well as how to print, make paper, and make gunpowder. They would lead huge trips all over the world. This was the Middle Kingdom, China. India is right next door. This was the business center of the whole world. In the 1800s, though, here in Europe and the United States, there was the start of a big revolution. Science, then machines, then guns, trains, cars, flights, bombs, industries, and cities. With their newfound power, these countries began to grow and take over big parts of the world. China remained a great place to live. But when the West showed up with big guns and started knocking on China's door, China couldn't match their firepower, so they had to give land to Britain. This is how we got Hong Kong. The Industrial Revolution didn't really happen in China the same way it did in the West, and by the middle of the 1800s, China's economic standing in the world was falling by a huge amount. 100 years later, things got a lot worse when China's neighbor, Japan, attacked it. China's economy was no longer the wealthy Middle Kingdom. Instead, it was a pathetic shadow of itself that was under the control of people from other places. After World War II ended, the West came up with a new economic and banking system for the whole world. It was based on the way the economy worked in the West, which was doing so well. It was still capitalism, with some government control and high taxes on the rich and big businesses, but it was still capitalism. And after the war, this kind of business would help a lot of countries. Fixing up Germany, Japan, France. For many people in the West, capitalism after World War II was like a magic potion that fixed everything. It worked so well that more and more people thought the government should get out of capitalism and let the market do its own thing. This guy was a big supporter of the idea of business with no rules. There has never been. It has done a better job of getting rid of poverty than the free market and the open enterprise system. Milton Friedman is an economist who lives and works in Chicago. If they fail, the cost is on them. If they do well, they will get the reward. The main idea behind this financial and economic system was that people who owned shares in a company would put money into that company. This is what we call a corporation, and its only goal was to make money for its owners or shareholders. In the words of Milton Friedman, the social duty of a business is to make more money. That's what a business is for. This model says that increasing short-term gains for owners would be good for everyone. And if you look at the facts in the United States and the West, Milton Friedman kind of had a point. It led to a lot of wealth in the West, as the US economy grew very fast. But hold on, what about China? Do we want to talk about the business of China? The Middle Kingdom, right? How about China? So, even though the US, even as corporate free market capitalism was taking over the world and making Western economies strong, China was falling further and further behind. China didn't join the capitalism party that the West was spreading around the world. Instead, it turned to a one-party rule communist system led by this guy, Mao Zedong, who destroyed any chance of China's economy ever joining the wealth going on around the world. By the 1970s, China had a lot of people who were poor. The once rich kingdom had hit its lowest point. All of that was about to change, though. So, it's the 1970s, and Deng Xiaoping is the new leader of China. He took power with the hope of ending China's 150 years of shame and the fall of China as a superpower. In other parts of the area, China's neighbors had economies that were part of the global economic party that capitalism was throwing, and they were doing well. They did great things for the economy and helped millions of people get out of poverty. Deng went to Singapore early in his time because it was a place where Chinese people had adopted the free market. And they did very well. He got an idea. The failed Maoist economic theory was over, and it was time to try out some kind of capitalism to see if China could rebuild its economy. But he had to do this carefully so that the one-party rule that China had set up wouldn't fall apart. So he chose to focus on just one small village. A sleepy town with about 30,000 people in southern China, right across the border from British-controlled Hong Kong, which was thriving at the time because of its hardcore capitalist economy. Deng Xiaoping made this small town a special economic zone, where foreign companies could set up shop and spend in a very free market based on capitalism. Hong Kong would be like a link between businesses in the West and this small door to communist China. It was still socialism, but it had some traits of Chinese capitalism. What happens next might be the most amazing thing that has ever happened in the world of business. This small, quiet town in China was a special economic zone. It started out as a fishing village with a few thousand people and some rice paddies, but now it is a huge city with more than 10 million people. The average pay jumped from $1 per day to more than $30,000 per year. All over China, this starts to happen, and in the meantime, Milton Friedman is back in the US. A number of towns in China were set aside for special economic activity, which is basically capitalism in a country that is socialist. And more companies from outside China moved there because the workers were so cheap. It turned into the workshop of the world. China followed this trend of other Asian economies and finally passed them to become the second largest economy on Earth. This is shown in a graph. Asia will make up more than half of the world's GDP this year, passing the rest of the world for the first time. It is a huge change in the economy, and it shows why China has become so strong. Okay, but hold on. This is a great story about how capitalism can pull millions of people out of poverty and turn a country into an economic powerhouse almost overnight. But we also need to talk about the other side of this story. I want to show you two graphs. The elephant graph is the name for it. Do you kind of understand why? Let's take this graph apart and try to figure out what it says about China's rise over the past 30 years. The amount of money that each person makes determines their position on this line. So, these people down here have the 10th percentile income, which is the lowest in the world. Then comes the 20th percentile, and so on, until you get to these people up here, who have the highest income in the world. With their income, they are in the 90th percentile. This line shows how much these people's incomes have grown in the last 35 years. Basically, when corporate capitalism was at its best and China was rising, so, you'll see how this goes in a moment. Let's start with a graph to show how much each of these groups' incomes has grown over the last 35 years. The wages of the bottom 10% grew by about 75%, which isn't bad. People who live in the poorest countries and make the least money in the world are in this group. The incomes of people in the 20th to 30th groups grew a lot over the past 35 years. 125% or more. This is like the huge income growth that the new middle class in China and other Asian countries saw. Because of globalization. Under this method, they did really well. But then you start getting to the 50th, 60th, 70th, and 80th percentiles. This is basically the middle class in the West. Their wages have grown much less quickly. Sometimes less than 50% in 35 years, which is a little more than 1% per year. There has been little rise in income, and some people in the West have seen their incomes go down. Like the blue-collar workers whose jobs went to China and Detroit and the Rust Belt. So far, you can see why this kind of makes sense. People in China who were helped by this mass industry got a lot out of it. People in the United States and the West whose jobs moved to China saw their incomes grow much more slowly. But keep an eye on what comes next. When we get to the 99th percentile, we're talking about the richest 1% of people in the world. And for this, I have to actually stretch out the graph to make it a bit more detailed. These are the people in the world with the most money. Let's look at how their pay has changed over the past 35 years. You can see that under this scheme, their income has grown by leaps and bounds. In the last 35 years, their income has grown by a factor of 3. Now, just to remind you, this is data from every country on Earth from the past 35 years. Everyone on Earth can see this. So, we can now see who the winners and losers are. Corporate capitalism, which has spread to Asia and other parts of the world. Most of the rewards of this system went to the top 1% of income earners. They get a lot more out of shareholder capitalism than anyone else. And the spread of world trade. So, that's the first graph I've made. It's the graph of the elephant. It is a great way to see how this form of capitalism has contributed to China's growth. This is how the second line looks. This shows how much CO2 each country puts into the air. Europe and the United States are your options. China is the country that puts out the most CO2 in the world. Like the graph of the elephants, this graph shows us that shareholder capitalism cares so much about short-term profits for shareholders that it doesn't think about how this economic activity affects the world we live in and our ability to live in it. You've probably heard this message a lot. And if you're like me, it's hard not to become numb to this looming crisis. We don't really know what it looks like, and it feels like there's nothing we can do, but we have to do everything really quickly. But let me say again in my own words that it is now a fact that our global climate is changing in a way that will probably cause huge changes to our planet and our ability to live there. It's already happening, and it will keep happening. The only thing we can do now is maybe slow down a little. Okay, let me just wrap this up and tell you what I think this all means in the end. I'm not showing you all these graphs because I'm a data nerd who loves to look at graphs, even though I kind of am. Sorry, but I'm showing you these plots because the story of China's rise is often a story about how capitalism has helped tens and hundreds of millions of people get out of poverty. And it has, which is really cool. But these graphs show us what else it has done and what else this type of business also encourages and leads to. If we want to look at the results of this type of capitalism, we have to look at all of them, not just some of them. So what should we do? Is this capitalism? Not at all. It's just a new way to think about business and globalization, a new take on capitalism. One that Milton Friedman would hate, but that more and more businesses are learning we need to use. The answer isn't to get rid of capitalism completely. Instead, in order to grow it, keep in mind not only the interests of shareholders and how to generate as much short-term profit as possible for them, but also the needs of other people who the business affects. These people can be called partners. This is the same as the clients. And the workers, the suppliers, the government, the economy as a whole, the environment, and, of course, the shareholders. This is called stakeholder capitalism, and all it really means is that businesses that only care about making money for their owners don't help everyone. People win and people lose. It's not good for a large part of the population or for the climate, which is changing. Oh, and just so you know, this isn't some far-left idea. Some of the biggest companies in the United States, like Walmart, Apple, and JP Morgan, have agreed to use a new form of capitalism. This is changing, and I think we will see it in the next 5 to 10 years. A new way to look at how businesses work together in the economy. So, as you might be thinking, I clicked on a movie about China's rise, and now we're talking about stakeholder capitalism. China's rise is a story about capitalism, or at least a certain kind of capitalism. It's a story about how business can change and adapt to what's going on in the world. We want companies to be a part of our society. If we want to make the most money in the least amount of time, the old shareholder plan is the best way to do that. But if you want businesses to help everyone, including our children and grandchildren and their ability to live on this earth, then our capitalism needs to include more than just that. Shareholders get money. What works for one stage of an economy's growth might not work for another. Carbon dioxide, a gas that has no color or smell, is what causes the so-called greenhouse effect. So I had to look through a lot of data for this video, and I was able to work with the World Economic Forum, which is a think tank I value. They were the first to come up with the idea of shareholder capitalism, long before Apple and Walmart thought it was a good idea. The head of the World Economic Forum just put out a book called Stakeholder Capitalism, which is a direct translation of the title. It gives a detailed look at the rise of Asia and China as well as other big trends that help us see why we need to improve our capitalism.